Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I'm here with Lea Booth, who I met at the Quillette Social a couple of weeks ago. He's written for Quillette quite a bit about nuclear energy. There is a growing movement, from what I can tell, about people being positive about nuclear energy. A lot of the fear tactics that we've heard since we were children, a lot of it has just kind of like not withstood the test of time, and I think for good reason. Some of that I want to get into, but let's just kind of start with your background and what got you interested in this topic.
Sure. So I first got exposed to energy in a class in college in my senior seminar, but the class was about like city policies. And so, a lot of cities have clean energy goals and energy efficiency goals. So we read about that and I thought it was really cool. And so I wrote my, senior paper on that, on how cities could take over their electric utility through municipalization, to do their own thing instead of having to depend on the corporate bosses and the state legislatures to do what they want. And that kind of sparked my interest. And after I graduated from college, I worked for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, working to elect Democrats in Virginia. And then um, COVID happened, but then I got a job working for my city councilman
Hmm.
in his reelection campaign. And then after that, I cold emailed Michael Schellenberger saying I read Apocalypse Never, which is a great book, and it was like, I'd love to work in your field. And so, we talked and he hired me at Environmental Progress. Um, so, I got experience, editing his Forbes and Substack pieces on energy, doing research for energy pieces, and then also research on other topics like homelessness in California. Um, he ran for governor. I was on his campaign, but after that, he basically, Environmental Progress has one part-time employee now, so
Mhm.
the staff were, let go. Um, so I've been writing freelance since then. He connected me with Quillette, so I got an article published there. Um, was one of their top 10 most read for 2022, and there's another in the works. And I'm going to be writing more about energy for them in the future. That and I have talked about doing that. Um, so that's me in a nutshell. And I think energy is it's intellectually fascinating. It's the reason, you wonder what's like, why for most of human history was everyone poor? It's like, well, because they hadn't figured out how to use fossil fuels yet.
Mhm.
Is really what it is. And we take energy for granted. At least we did until very recently. And it turns out if you want to be rich, you have to have lots of cheap energy. And if you want to be poor, you either have no energy, or as Europe's finding out, expensive energy. It's a great way to make people poor. Um, so the stakes are high, but that's what makes it fun. So
What is your assessment of the popularity of nuclear energy right now? So I do know that a lot of boomer types probably still have a lot of fear about the nuclear energy. I know that there still is a lot of propaganda. I mean, propaganda out there about the harms of nuclear energy. I say propaganda in quotes because I mean there are real harms, right? I mean nothing comes without any cost. Everything has a cost to it.
mhm.
But kind of in my assessment, I'm pro at every level getting away from fossil fuels. I have some problems with solar panels and wind. I think that they all do have some problems. The main one is this is just a Michael Schellenberger talking point, but you just need so much more space and so much more resources to do wind, solar, anything. You see that like solar panels taking over huge swaths of deserts in order to get just like a fraction of the energy you need to power a city, that sort of a thing.
Mhm.
Whereas with nuclear power, one little plant, you can power half a state. You know, and you're using just a little teeny bit of uranium to do that with, which is just like that's seems like to me like that's screaming at us that's the future. And I think that a lot of people like me, of the millennial generation and younger, are just kind of convinced by that sort of a viewpoint. I mean, everyone kind of agrees we got to get away from fossil fuels, unless like you're just a right wing person who, for some reason, thinks fossil fuel is still exciting for some like own libs reason. I don't know, but what's kind of like your assessment of the popularity among, let's say, U.S. folks? I kind of looked into stats in this, but I don't remember offhand. But do you have any, assessment of the popularity now and in the future?
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't looked. Well, so the polling data in the U.S. most recent, I haven't looked at by generation, but for the first time, I think maybe a year or two ago, nuclear power polled above 50% approval
Okay. Wow.
ever. And it's not like it's 51-49. I think it's 51-ish approve, maybe, and then you have a certain amount that don't know at all, and then probably 30 something that disapprove. So that's a big deal. You could, you go to lawmakers now and say, look, nuclear is popular in your district, nuclear is popular in your state.
Mhm.
States around the country are ending their nuclear bans, like West Virginia ended their ban. A lot of states are seeing nuclear as a way to revitalize coal communities. And so, things are changing. In Illinois, they saved their nuclear plants in a really tough, down to the wire political fight.
Mhm.
And now those plants, because of high fossil fuel prices, are saving their consumers $1 billion a year.
Whoa.
So, so hopefully stories like that get out and people realize just how big a deal nuclear's energy security is. And then, of course, so much of energy is economic. So when fossil fuels become expensive, nuclear just becomes more attractive.
Mhm.
And that polling data I mentioned, that was before the energy crisis. So I haven't looked at polling data post energy crisis, but I would be shocked if nuclear was somehow less approved of now than
Right.
it was 18 months ago.
It really does seem like a state by state thing. That's what I always kind of read in these articles about, like, it's this state is doing this, that state. At what level is this a federal issue? Does the federal government play any important role right now in making nuclear go forward?
Yeah, I mean, nuclear lives or dies by the federal government right now through regulatory power.
Okay.
Um, So, well, first, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law both provide a lot of money for nuclear, both to save current reactors and then to build small modular nuclear reactors.
Mhm.
Um, it's the biggest investment. Those bills are the biggest investment in nuclear since the 60s. And so that's a huge deal.
Mhm.
But the reason that these nuclear plants take so long to build is one, they're first of a kind, which always takes a long time to build in industrial processes. But then also the regulations are just absolutely insane. Vogtle in Georgia is the only nuclear plant in the U.S. currently under construction. It's been under construction for 24 years.
Oh man, see, that's depressing. It really is.
And so there's a story recently of like this pipe fitting became loose or something. And so they have to replace the pipe fitting. It should take them maybe 12 hours, but it's going to take them a month and cost them $1 million a day because the NRC requires a massive amount of paperwork just to make a minor fix.
Mhm.
And I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening because the environmental movement is, they explicitly admitted in the 70s and 60s that we're going to scaremonger about nuclear to increase regulatory burdens to make the energy source uneconomical, and they've succeeded.
Oh wow, I didn't know
Yeah.
that they're that explicit about it.
Oh, I mean, sometimes people say the quiet part out loud. I don't know if
Mhm.
somehow Schellenberger found an interview. I don't know. I don't remember. But it was like the president of the Sierra Club. It wasn't just some rando organizer.
Mhm.
Um, but it doesn't have to be this way. Like Russia, China, and South Korea all build nuclear plants within 5 to 8 years.
France too, right? France is pretty quick, I think.
Oh, they were back in the day. I mean, in the
Okay.
70s and the 80s, not anymore.
Okay.
No one in the West builds quickly anymore.
Okay.
Um, but also just from some historical perspective, there's 441 nuclear reactors currently operating. The mean construction time for these reactors was 7.5 years.
Whoa, that's fast.
Yeah. So
Wow.
this when anti-nuclear people say nuclear is too slow,
Mhm.
that is explicitly a Western perspective that is ahistorical and misses out on the other stuff the rest of the world's doing.
Interesting. Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So jumping ahead a little bit, but modular nuclear reactors, a design was just approved this week or last week by the US government. So that is going to be going forward, and that has like Bill Gates money behind it. He has one of these companies.
Yeah.
Bill Gates at least thinks that this is kind of the future. What is your take on modular nuclear reactors? I know this is another thing that it's not going to be built for years out into the future, but presumably once they do have a design that not only is approved but is built, they'll be able to replicate it pretty quickly and pretty cost effectively. Because I've read something about how they can design these on site and just build them up. And also, I mean, they're small, there's so you can build them for a neighborhood rather than, for a full city, that sort of thing. But what is your perspective on that technology?
Yeah, I think that the strongest case for small modular reactors is that they fill a niche that nuclear currently can't fill, which is these, big light water reactors, the gigawatt plants. They can't produce heat for industrial processes like 1,000 degrees Celsius, for example. And so if we want to decarbonize heavy industry, we're going to need SMRs, and SMR is going to be much more efficient at that than wind and solar, which kind of makes intuitive sense. Like imagine turning electricity into 1,000 degrees Celsius versus just splitting atoms. Like
Right.
it just doesn't quite make much sense. Like imagine your electric stove. Like no one likes the electric stoves, which is a hot topic, but we don't have to get in that particular can of worms. But and then also smaller nations like Estonia wants to get a 300 megawatt small modular reactor from GE Hitachi. There's only 1.1 or 1.3 million people in Estonia, so they can't. If they had a 1 gigawatt plant, that would basically be the entire country, and you don't want your entire electricity supply to be in one facility.
Right.
So they need smaller stuff, and we've built SMRs before. I mean, all the plants started back in the 50s and 60s were small plants, and so building
Hmm.
small is not a big deal. It's the question of the economics of scale versus economics of repeatability. We scaled up our nuclear plants over time because it was cheaper that way, or at least they thought it was cheaper. Costs in a lot of countries ended up rising after they started building these huge plants, not in South Korea or Russia and China, but in other places. Um, Actually, no, I'm sorry. Russia and China, they don't publish their figures. It's likely that they're under,
Okay.
but um,
When
but
I've sorry to interrupt, but when I've gone on to the websites of these small modular nuclear reactors, like I've been on Bill Gates' website and a couple of others of these companies, there's like an excitement about it as if it's like Tesla or like a tech company, and
yeah,
it feels like there is just a lot of like energy from like Silicon Valley around these sorts of things, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of bureaucracy that's necessarily holding it down. Like when you start looking into proper nuclear facilities, do you think that just one, if I'm assessing that right, but two, like do you think that just that natural energy and the interest from Silicon Valley folks and private billionaires, do you think that that could help push that technology forward more quickly than it otherwise might be?
I mean, they're definitely true
Mhm.
believers with pockets.
Yeah.
I think nuclear's problem is not going to be lack of private sector interest, so long as government gives the signals to the private sector that it's worth pursuing, and they're not going to kill the biz.
Yeah.
I mean, globally, there's 70 reactor designs being tried out around the globe right now that are, advanced or like new types of nuclear that aren't just the standard big water reactors. Um, I mean, I've talked to people. There's definitely Silicon Valley types. Gotta love some tech nuke bros.
Yep.
I want to hang out with them. Um, so no, so I mean, I don't think money is a problem as long as the government says, we'll help you out. And it's happening in the US, like the government's spending a lot of money to do public-private partnerships with companies like Bill Gates's TerraPower to demonstrate nuclear reactors. I mean, all these new reactors, like NuScale, someone that recently got approved. I mean, they've
Right.
gotten government funding too, which makes sense. It's these first of a kind builds are going to be really they're going to be uneconomical, the
Mhm.
first. And so the question is, can you make it economical? And I think there's a lot of smart people working on this, and the idea of using factories is not a crazy idea to cut down costs. A lot of the folks I've talked to compare um, what they want to do with SMRs to aircraft. It's like an airplane takes a very unsafe activity, which is being at 30,000 feet in the air, and through lots of incredible engineering, makes it incredibly safe, like way
Mhm.
safer than driving, of course. And these planes, 737 is like what 10,000 parts. So I mean, these aren't simple machines, but they produce them at factories, and that's how they make these planes affordable. You order a bunch, so that way you get the repeatability, and then you just crank them out, and it works out economically. Fortunately, like the Tennessee Valley Authority has already signaled it's like, yeah, we would love to buy like 20, 30 of these nuclear reactors,
Oh, wow.
which is what you need. Otherwise, this
Right.
doesn't work if customers don't say, "Look, I want 20."
Right.
Um,
Right.
and like Russia and China, one reason they're so good at building nuclear is because Like China's like ordering dozens of plants at a time.
Okay, that
They
makes
have
sense. Yeah.
150 plants under proposal right now. Um, but no, so the ingredients are good. There's private funding. The one thing that's in the way is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is terrible.
Mm,
Of course, like the Breakthrough Institute, which is a great think tank, recently just published a quick article about the new Nuclear Regulatory Commission's most recently released regulations for advanced nuclear reactors. Like the Congress in 2019 passed a bill to have the NRC come up with a new regulatory pathway for these different types of reactors because the current pathway is only for large water cooled reactors. And the Breakthrough Institute just totally took it to task, saying that the safety scenarios employed by the NRC were ridiculous. One of the scenarios was this plant's going to have a major meltdown every year and then get fixed every year for 40 years. And it's like, if that's your bar, of course it's not going to work. Like the regulations, that's insane. Like
hmm
no one, I think even the most rabid anti-nuclear people don't think every plant's going to blow up once a year every year. Um, and so that kind of there just needs to be major changes there. And I don't know how to fix the NRC, but Congress, these business folks need to make sure that the NRC, we need to, if the NRC isn't fixed, nuclear is not going to get very far. So
hmm
that is the biggest challenge. We talked about federal issues. Like if the NRC doesn't get fixed, then I think nuclear is the future, but it's going to take a long time if the NRC
Yeah.
is not fixed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to run down some of the problems with nuclear, at least the perceived problems. So let me just start very generally, which is that, I mean, I do want to kind of like steel man the arguments against nuclear, right? To have an
Sure.
interesting conversation. A lot of people that I respect, just smart people, maybe environmentalists, but maybe not, they will just stereotype the pro-nuclear people who are just like, diehard nuclear fans, and they will call them like the nuclear bros on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
How do you respond to, and they would probably lump you into that category of like a nuclear bro on Twitter, right? Who's someone who's on Twitter just like tweeting about nuclear is awesome,
Yeah.
guys. What are we
Yeah.
doing? Why aren't we doing this? And quickly shooting down like the anti-nuclear rhetoric with like quick talking points, right?
Yeah.
Well, how would you respond to the general framing that there is this world of over-eager nuclear bros out there, particularly on Twitter? What's your take on that as framing?
So, I'm still relatively new to Twitter, so I don't know everything about the various the Twitterati, the tweet storming. But I mean, polling for nuclear shows that for it is gendered. Men are much more likely than women to support nuclear.
Hmm.
And so the idea that there are hordes of young guys on the internet promoting nuclear on Twitter is probably pretty accurate. And it's
We seem to fit that mold, I guess.
yeah,
I've
which
been
is
quite
fine. I
guilty
mean,
of this, right?
when they're like, oh, it's like people are mean on Twitter. So like I'm sure there are plenty
Yeah,
of nuclears who are total jerks on Twitter, but it's not like the anti-nuclear people are all like the models of British politeness or something.
yeah, for sure. Right.
And so if someone says like, oh, that's just the nuke bros, like if they're dismissing you by just saying that you're a bro, then they are not a serious thinker,
hmm
obviously. Um, so that perception, that political perception problem is not something I've really put much thought into, but I think nuclear can survive some guys on the internet being mean about it. You know what I mean?
Well,
Like,
this is kind of like my perspective is that all the people who are pro-nuclear, in order to be pro-nuclear, I think this includes you. We haven't spoken too much, but the people who are into this, they have to really know their stuff, right? Because it's not necessarily the cool thing to believe, although it's getting to be the cool thing, I think. But it's kind of not like the pro solar, pro wind, all anything that's like Green New Deal stuff on the left. That's cool. Like it's you're not
mhm.
going to get any pushback from the mainstream anything if you're into those things, if you drive an EV, right? Whereas to be nuclear, it's still kind of like radical. And so to me, the people who believe these things who are pro-nuclear, they tend to not be super naive about it. Whereas other folks, they can get away with being a little naive because they're not constantly facing criticism for it. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, for my own journey, I started when I first got interested in energy, I just assumed that solar and wind were super fantastic,
Me
because
too.
like they're no
Yeah.
carbon. They don't have fuel costs. They don't have fuel at all. The fuel's renewable. Like they must be amazing. And then only got to nuclear later, and I don't know how many. Maybe I come from the left side of the aisle. Maybe in certain Republican circles, people go from not caring about energy straight to nuclear. Um, but I think for most people, yeah, you have to learn the benefits of nuclear
Hmm.
in depth. And I certainly wouldn't like nuclear if I didn't find the arguments incredibly compelling. And I've spent a lot of time like reading reports about like Fukushima radiation and that kind of stuff to get my own viewpoints
Right.
and of nuclear solidified. So
Yeah,
um,
like those incidences, they're inherently terrifying. I remember being a kid, and fearing those irrationally, just fearing that sort of a
mhm,
disaster, and being like, oh, I hope we don't live near one of these plants,
yeah,
which is just kind of funny. But I think that's also fine. I think it's fine to be scared of things that are unusual. Uh, do you know Peter Zion? Have you followed him at all? I really
yeah,
like this
and it's
guy. Fun to listen to. I don't know if I agree with him on everything or whatever
yeah.
because I'm not a geopolitical analyst myself. So I only like read New York Times articles and listen to him and have a couple of perspectives. He's talked to Ian Bremmer, and even Ian Bremmer like gives credence to a lot of what he says. And so I don't think he's that radical, but he says things that are kind of shocking. And he's just fun to listen to and has a big audience right now. He is, as he says, broadly pro-nuclear. The reasons that he says that he's not completely bullish on it are, one, expensive. Everyone agrees with that. We all acknowledge that, I think. Two, nuclear waste. It doesn't go away for a very long time. And the US government argues about where to put the nuclear waste, even though clearly we can store it safely. No state is like, hey, put it in my backyard, so it becomes a political issue, and politicians just don't want to deal with that. I think that's a real honest criticism. Although, there are obviously ways to store it safely. And three, he says that, and this I don't know about, but he says that when we try to take nuclear waste and turn it into a reusable fuel source, then that process right now makes it scarily close to being what the sort of material that can be used in a nuclear weapon. And so that's why we're very cautious about going down that road. What is your response to Peter Zion and those points?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to nuclear waste, I think the important thing to know is that one, there's not a lot of it. All the nuclear
Mhm.
waste in the United States can fit on one football field, stacked 70 feet high, and that's 60 years of power production. I mean, that's insane. Like a football field worth of solar panels is worth like 1/1000th of a nuclear plant. I mean, just to put
Yeah, wow.
this ice in that number is just me guesstimating. That is not like a calculated figure, but you get what I'm saying. Um, and then it's also not hard to handle. No one's ever been hurt in the history of civilian nuclear waste. We store it in cooling pools for 5 to 10 years. Water is actually such a good shield of radiation that you can swim in the pools with the waste without getting harmed.
Wow.
So engineers in the 50s used to do that for the lulz. So I hope if there are any nuclear companies listening, I will swim in the cooling pool on video and put it on the internet to show people that nuclear is safe. So
That's
just
good.
saying, if there's anyone out there. And then cost, like I said, the first of a kind builds are really expensive, but like the Koreans and the Russians just built the Emiratis 4 beautiful nuclear reactors, each one built in less than 10 years. I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but it's generating 25% of their power and very affordably. So this idea that nuclear is super expensive again is a historical Western view. In Germany, the nuclear plants they're closing down generate the cheapest power in the country. In Canada, um, well, no, in Ontario, which is almost all of Canada's nuclear plants, nuclear is the second most affordable after hydroelectric. Um, so, and then like the United States, nuclear was, considered to be more expensive when natural gas was super cheap. But now look how things have turned.
Mhm.
Um, so, like nuclear doesn't have to be expensive.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And do you have any of those concerns about when you refine, or whatever the term is, nuclear waste into another fuel source, that it could be used as a nuclear weapon at that point? Do you know anything about that? This I have not had a chance to look into.
Yeah, when Zehan, that was on Joe Rogan, he talked about that,
Yeah.
and you know, people in kind of in my orbit who I trust and who are, you know, experts or journalists and stuff, were all like, this is total BS. Like, that is not how it works. But I couldn't tell you, I haven't read up on like the physics of it to be like, oh yeah, it turns plutonium X into plutonium Y. You know what I
Right.
mean? But like, it's like, you know, most, let's say we only had nuclear nations that already had nuclear bombs. That's most of the world's carbon emissions. Um, and so like, it's not, if the US can make bomb material out of, by recycling nuclear waste, one, there's not going to be a lot of it because there's not even that much waste in the first place. But two, who cares? Like, what do people expect? We're going to make a little bomb material, then sell it to the Russians? Like, that's
Right.
insane.
Okay. That's a good
You know what I
point.
mean?
Yeah.
Like, who
Right.
cares? No, so the question is really, when you export it to countries that, you know, you don't necessarily want to have nuclear weapons. I mean, I talked to uh, some nuclear experts from my last piece for Quillette, and I asked, you know, does nuclear proliferation of nuclear energy lead to bomb proliferation? They all said no. And they said the only way to make bombs out of civilian nuclear energy stuff is to buy facilities, to create really expensive, difficult to make facilities to refine uranium and plutonium. So I'm skeptical that it's really a problem.
I see. Okay. So what would be your steel man of the anti-nuclear case? One thing, you know, I really don't even want to get into the whole like, oh, Fukushima is scary, because no one has died from nuclear accidents, or like virtually no one has died, whereas people die all the time from falling off roofs installing solar panels, and that's a real human life that is lost from this technology. And we need, and people die, like thousands of Americans die every year from car fumes, like on and on. I mean, so like the deaths from nuclear power, I don't consider that at all a point against nuclear, because you can just like look at the charts and like literally no one's died. But like putting that aside, unless you think that that's worth steel manning, what do you think is the best case against nuclear, if you were to present that case?
Yeah, I think I would definitely put safety in as part of the steel man, if nothing else, because one, it's really important. The next piece I want to write for Quillette, I wanted to write about like Fukushima and the actual impacts of Fukushima.
Hmm.
Because if nuclear isn't safe like the antis say, then we should only use it at a minimum.
Hmm.
So that's, I mean, that's a huge consideration. But then we've talked about cost, waste. I mean, the benefits of solar and wind are, you know, they have no fuel costs. They're easy to manufacture. Uranium, I mean, nuclear plants have uranium, which obviously is a fuel, but it's actually, they're just much more difficult to manufacture.
Hmm.
People say, well, these nuclear plants take too long to build, which, I mean, we already talked about how that's an inaccurate view. Um, so, I mean, when it comes to safety, like Chernobyl, you know, caused probably over 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer, and exposed millions of people to some dosage of radiation. Same with Fukushima. Um, and then, of course, 3 Mile Island, you know, the reactor blew up and radiation escaped into the air. What people don't tell you is like less than 300 people have been killed in nuclear accidents in the United States, like, and not in the
Hmm.
United States, in the world, in the history
Yeah.
of the technology. Like Chernobyl's probably, you know, around 245, 250 deaths. And it's because thyroid cancer is really treatable, and radiation is just not as dangerous as people think it is, really.
Hmm.
Fukushima, it is estimated maybe one person has died from radiation from Fukushima. And that's the second worst accident in the history of the technology.
Right.
And it's like, yes, a big plume of radiation did impact people around Japan, but most of the dosages were equivalent to just living on Earth for a year. And you know, the scientists who say that creates a major cancer risk, that's just simply not a credible
Yeah,
argument.
and people who would say that is just compare it to the thousands and thousands of Americans who live next to coal plants, and
Yeah.
how bad that is for their health and their children's health. I mean, it's not even comparable in my mind.
Yeah, no, nuclear has saved millions of lives. by displacing fossil fuels. Like no question about it. No question about it. So, like one of the craziest facts I learned about Chernobyl was that the after the accident, only one of the reactors blew up. After the high level radiation dissipated and they cleaned up the now exploded reactor, they turned the other reactors on, and then used them for power until 2000. And when the Ukrainian government closed Chernobyl, the workers at Chernobyl protested the closure of the plant. Like, these are workers who are like, yeah, I love working at Chernobyl. Said what no one would think you'd ever hear that sentence. No one's like, oh, Chernobyl, a great workplace.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Um, and like with the waste, after 400 years, you can hold it in your hand. So this idea that we have to like shield this waste for tens of thousands of years or we'll poison the earth irrevocably is just not accurate. It's like, yeah, after 400 years, don't eat it. Um, that's not that hard, guys. Not eating radioactive waste is like really easy.
Right.
So, and then of course, like solar panels, some of, I don't know if this is still true, but in 2019, it was true that a lot of them contain heavy metals like lead and cadmium,
Right.
which are toxic because they're elements in perpetuity. They don't get cleaner. Nuclear waste becomes less dangerous over time. Lead does not. And so, one of the things that's so compelling about nuclear is that, like, I think what we've touched on, but like, there's just so many myths around it.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be pro-nuclear, you've had to read about how the myths are fake. And so that, requires you to know stuff. No, but nuclear kicks ass. That's the summary of that point.
What is your take on the folks who are way into the green movement, but in sort of this like anti-human way, where they think that we just need to use less energy across the board, and if the way to a healthy future is kind of like to return to nature and use less energy and have less shit. What's your response to them?
Yeah, well, they don't understand that nuclear ends energy scarcity. They don't understand that nuclear ends environmental harm associated with energy production. Like, it just hasn't, like, for all of industrial modernity, industrial processes have had substantial negative impacts on the environment, and they just don't get that that doesn't have to be true. Like, we've invented our way out of this problem, and instead they're the chief opponents of it.
Mm-hmm.
And why that is, Schellenberger says it's a religious thing, which maybe that's right. It's They certainly see nuclear as evil. They perceive it as unnatural and unholy. And while solar and wind are like, it's the appeal to nature fallacy. Like, these are good because they're in harmony with nature. And nuclear is like, energy for all of human history has been through combustion. And so, like, now what you can understand, like coal, it's like, how does this work? Oh, you just light it on fire. I know what fire is like, so I'm not scared. Mm-hmm. Uranium, I'm scared of. This is terrifying. So they, the energy scarcity mindset, it's going to take a long time, I think, until the world comes around to nuclear. Like, it's not going to come before nuclear. It's not going to be until we convince everyone to love nuclear that it'll click. Like, oh, we can do all the things our grandparents dreamed of doing, and all the people who live in energy poverty, what they dream of.
Right.
We could make that happen without destroying the environment. So hopefully those environmental groups come around. I do think about like that what would happen if after 3 Mile Island, if the environmental movement had been dedicating millions of dollars and billions of man hours to promoting nuclear instead of demonizing it. It's like, there wouldn't be any myths if the world's most powerful environmental organizations were had spent decades promoting nuclear. Like, I just think, like, you'd have the resources to get rid of the myths. So they need to get out of the way, damn
it. So I do like this idea that we do broadly need to get away from the scarcity mindset. I think that it is just, I mean, one, it's lame, and two, we are just going to keep using more energy, whether anyone likes it or not. The people who complain about this, in my mind, they can't not be hypocrites, even if they don't, even if they want to be as non-hypocritical as possible, just because of the world we live in. And the world is not going to deconstruct itself. It's going to be continue to be more energy, require more energy just to function in your house, as we get like smart houses and everything all of a sudden plugs in. So I really do like this idea of, and I think this is inevitable, that we are going to, if we just look a couple hundred years out, we're going to be a planet that consumes way more energy. A lot of the countries like India that have, 20 times the population of the US, all of them are going to want the US's goodies sometime in the next 100 years, right? And they're gonna get them, and that's gonna require a lot of energy, right? So I think that we're gonna need to scale up our energy production no matter what it is going forward. And what I love about this and thinking this way is that I mean, we have the ability right now to have overabundance of energy. It's completely possible. Peter Thiel, who I'm not a huge fan of, but like he was talking somewhat recently at Stanford, and he was saying that I believe this was him, or maybe it was a tweet that I saw related to him, that he has this organization where he encourages you to drop out of college and to start your own company, right?
Mhm.
And apparently, when you show up to this thing, a fellowship or whatever exactly it is, they'll say like, okay, what's your business plan? Like, okay, well, I want to serve 10,000 people with like X product, and they'll say to you, okay, how do you serve 10 million people with this product? And like, whoa, okay, ooh, okay, now I have to think way bigger. That's what I think we should be doing with energy. I think that okay, so we have a planet of 8 billion people. How would we solve this if right now today the planet had 20 billion people? And then start there, and then have that conversation. I was recently watching the YouTube channel Real Life Lore, and he had this episode about the Sahara Desert and how if we put solar panels across the entire Sahara, it would, which is completely infeasible for a number of reasons. But let's just say if we were to hypothetically do that, we would have just from solar panels 7 times the energy we need right now to power the whole planet. So that that's solar panels, and that's just like one project. And we could, it's silly, but that is a thing. What is your perspective on going way out there with your predictions for the future about what we should or can or could do to power the planet in the year 3000, when we have conceivably quite a few more people, and whether or not we have more people, if we have more people who need the American equivalent of the good life with all the electricity we use.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, environmentalists who think using less is the answer to our energy problems, it's like that's just a terrible strategy. Like, we're not going to be using less energy. Actually, in the developed world, energy use is flatlined because things have gotten more efficient, which is pretty wild considering that we have like smartphones that we didn't have 20 years ago, and everyone's using them all the time, and everyone has a laptop, and there's just so many computers using energy, yet our energy use hasn't skyrocketed, which is pretty remarkable. But of course, with EVs, I mean, people are expecting energy use to go up in the developed world, and then the developing world, billions of people are in energy poverty where they don't have enough energy to be anything but poor. And this great journalist Robert Bryce has something he calls the iron law of electricity, which is people will do what they have to get power.
Hmm.
And Germany's showing that. It's like Russia cut off the gas, so we're going to destroy our own villages and old growth forests for coal.
Yeah.
They'd rather destroy the forests for coal than go hungry, which
Hmm.
makes sense. And then, so yeah, you think about a planet like we're probably going to get to 10 billion people, right? And who knows, maybe in year 3000, there'll be 20 billion people. You never know. Um, like nuclear is obviously the best candidate for a world with massive energy needs because of its energy density. 1 pound of nuclear fuel is equivalent to 1 million pounds of Tesla batteries.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think these numbers are, I'm pretty sure it's like every 1 ton Tesla battery requires moving 500,000 pounds of rock. So, like, that's just a mind boggling. Imagine how much rock that is for 1 million pounds of Tesla batteries compared to 1 pound of uranium.
Hmm.
Like when you think about it that way, it's one of the reasons why nuclear ends scarcity, because it just takes so little fuel to generate so much power. And then when you talk about solar panels over the Sahara, one, we can't just put solar where the best sun is, because that's not necessarily where people are, and transmission
Right.
is really efficient. But here's an example. In China, the largest solar plant in the world is in China, in the desert, and I think in Tibet, and it takes up 50 square kilometers. And in comparison, the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California takes up less than 1 square kilometer, but generates 6 times more power.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And of course, it does that as the most reliable energy source on the planet, in terms of extreme weather, in terms of just working. It has the highest capacity factor, generates power more of the time than any other power source. Um, and so when you think about a planet of 20 billion people, it's like, where are they all going to go? If there going to be solar panels literally everywhere if we have a planet of 20 billion people all using US levels of power. And even then, all these solar panels, because they don't work at night for some reason, would need backup. From from what, fossil fuels, like from nuclear. So um just the energy density of nuclear it's like, that's why it's scalable.
Hmm.
And there's nothing else even close. It's I forget how much more dense it is than coal, but like if it's orders of magnitude more dense than any other energy source available, even natural gas, which is like the best fossil fuel.
Right, right. So, one last question about energy related, and then I want to pivot just a little bit with some other random questions that I'm kind of curious to pick your brain on. But I've been talking about this a lot lately. What are your thoughts on cities of the future? A lot of these are, part of the baseline proposal is they're going to be green. Some of
Sure.
them use, are really heavily dependent on wind or solar panels, or they all have a conception for how they're going to do this, but they all like have energy as a central component of uh, building them. So that's kind of curious if you have any hot takes on these, and have you looked into any of these, like the line in Saudi Arabia, there's Tolosa in the United States, there's a bunch more of these floating cities in Asia, this sort of thing. Do you have any perspectives on these?
Sure. So I've looked into the line in Tolosa specifically. And I think obviously if they weren't talking about energy at all, then they would be completely unserious.
Yeah,
Um, though of course, like the line is, I think, like the line is incredibly implausible.
me too.
Like, first of all, powering a city with renewable energy, it's like, okay, well, what are you gonna do when the wind doesn't blow for 2 weeks, and also it's the winter, so it's only sunny 7 hours a day.
Yeah,
Um, so that's pretty unserious, and the Saudis probably know better and are just using it as PR.
that's
Um,
my thought, honestly. Yeah.
so, and then they want to build it, like they want to build really tall to save land from environmental use, but urban areas, half the world lives in urban areas, and it only takes up 1% of the habitable land mass. And so urban areas are actually already very space efficient.
Hmm.
And so if you're an environmentalist concerned about this, which I think you should be, like the more space that we take up, the less space there is for protected lands. The goal should just be to create denser cities, or even
Yeah.
just denser suburbs, like turning suburbs from 1 home per acre to 4 units per acre. I mean, that would be radical. That would be a radical change.
I love that perspective, actually. That's great. Yeah. I never even thought about making suburbs more dense, but that's a great perspective.
Yeah, which I could say I thought of it. I did not. Someone else thought of that. But yeah, and then like the line is supposed to be 500 meters tall, for 173 kilometers, which is the height of the Empire State Building. It would be equivalent to building like thousands of Empire State Buildings over and over again.
Right.
And the reason we don't build everything up super vertically is because it's more expensive than building a suburb. Um, among other reasons. Some people just don't like tall buildings. Like that's a whole aesthetic thing. But if they think this line is going to be affordable for people, like good luck with that, guys. Good
Yeah.
luck with that. Either you're
That's
going to lose
yeah.
money or it's going to be luxury condos. Like, so, and then like another thing too is that like cities obviously have problems, but they're kind of a tried and true solution for boosting your economy. Like
Mhm.
one of the great things about cities is that they increase the GDP output and worker efficiency of the workers there. Like that's why, bigger cities pay better, is because those workers are literally just turning out more product, if you will. Um, and urban economists will show you it's like, oh, these urbanization increases GDP through network effects and other benefits. And so like cities are already super great.
Yeah.
And also the line is only supposed to be 200 meters wide. Like everyone is just going to get very claustrophobic.
Yeah.
Like that's
That's what I'm
200
thinking
meters.
too.
You
Yeah.
couldn't even fit a baseball field in the line. Well, I mean, you could fit the field, but how are you going to fit a modern stadium in it?
Right.
I mean, how are you going to fit a modern stadium? Um, so it seems like kind of I just don't get the point. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's like at least with Toulouse, I can see it's like, oh, you're building a traditional city, but you're founding it using tons of kind of unorganically using tons of billionaire money. Like that, at
Right.
least that makes a little more sense than the line. Because they want to have this the architecture for Toulouse is really weird. Personally, I
Hmm.
like traditional architecture. I think like
Me too. Yeah.
we're slowly getting back to where we're doing like a mix of doing hybrid traditional but with modern elements like huge windows.
Hmm.
Like the Toulouse images I saw looked pretty hideous. Um,
I'm actually writing a piece about this right now where I'm just kind of like ranting about these future cities, how they just, I don't know, they don't have any like the human warmth of a city that's grown up over thousands of years, like European
yeah,
cities or, East Coast cities, or, walking through Brooklyn or wherever, where it's like there's so much warmth and humanity all around you that
yeah,
it's the equivalent of walking through a forest because it's so organic in some sense that this
yeah.
glass and steel and white walls just kind of doesn't fulfill that.
Yeah, I mean, I like modernism, but I
I
think,
do too. Maybe we're
yeah,
actually similar on this because I love modernism, but
yeah,
I think that you do, and there's probably a way to do this. Maybe we're just like not there yet, but I think that you can have a modern facility that has exposed brick wall and exposed, steel beams. There's like just a couple of touches can make ultra
yeah.
modernism still warm and human.
Well, I mean, traditional architecture has lasted for so long because it's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I definitely think that when it comes to energy too, like doing the tried and true is like if there's a solution that already works, just do that. Like
Right. Right.
don't waste your time trying to reinvent the wheel. It's like it turns out wheels have worked for thousands of years. Um, like
Until the day they stop working.
yeah, because physics is going to change that. Um, so no, but like with energy, it's like how do we decarbonize from fossil fuels? It's like, well, we already know that nuclear replaces fossil fuels 1 to 1. Like nuclear
Yeah.
is even more reliable than fossil fuels. Like we know that's that. You know what I mean? And when it comes to new nuclear designs, like we should explore all the different types of designs, but it's a good thing investors are working on small modular water cooled designs because like those probably have the best shot. I'm
Mhm.
not going to discount other designs because the water cooled ones often aren't the type that can produce really great industrial heat. Um, but like water cooled works, like we know how it works. So that's tried and true. And then I mean with cities like we went to New Orleans for the Quillette Social. I went to a wedding in Charleston. These historical areas are absolutely beautiful.
Oh, they're so
You know,
good. Oh
and they
my
give you
God.
so much life. And
Yeah.
so many American cities are absolutely devoid of that.
Hmm.
And so like these utopias should just look at currently existing cities and just kind of copy what they do. And that's what the Toulouse people would say they're doing. Like we want to have like Scandinavian equity with some other stuff like Japanese
They
trains or
have
something.
kind of the right buzzwords, but I don't trust them. I don't. I don't trust them.
That guy has Walmart money. You can't trust that
Well,
guy.
they need some more like just punk rock spirit in there. I don't know. They need some more like some graffiti artists to help design that. I don't know, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna get a little bit short on time, but I do want to pick your brain just a little bit on the homelessness issue since you have worked on Schellenberger with on this topic. I interviewed him for Quillette, got
Cool.
his whole spiel. I've read his book on this. I've read quite a bit about the homelessness issue. I'm at a position right now where I just am. getting very bleak and down on it. I don't think that anything's going to happen. I think this is just going to be the status quo in America, especially like San Francisco for a very long time. And I think that that's just because every time, at least speaking in terms of San Francisco, every time a good idea comes along that will help solve the problem, there's a lawsuit from the ACLU or something like that that makes it so that we can't actually do anything, even if 90% of the population in San Francisco is totally fed up, right? And
Yeah.
so the way that like we're structured in America, I just think that there are too many ways for radical leftists, let's say, to I don't like terms like that, but to channel Schellenberger, the radical left, let's say, they just have too many tools to make it so that our law enforcement and everything is ineffectual. Plus, in San Francisco, we can't. There's just no space to build facilities to house people, especially like if what Schellenberger says is true, 30% of the homeless population comes from out of the city. So the absolute second there are the facilities to house enough people, you're going to get another influx of homeless people, and the problem just expand. I mean, I'm very down on this topic. I am very bleak, and I'm at where Tim Dillon is at, where he joked about Los Angeles is just let's just call it the homeless capital of the world. He was joking when he said this, but he was just kind of like, let's just embrace it. This is just what we do well. We have homeless people, and so we're gonna have tour buses going through Skid Row now, and let's just embrace it. I'm literally getting that cynical on this topic. Do you have any optimism left on this topic, or I mean, kind of where are you at with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, not every democratic city is San Francisco or LA, so it's California and the West Coast uniquely bad political culture on this issue is
Yeah,
the
I
problem.
recently moved to Sacramento, and it's not nearly as bad here, but it's bad, and it's worse than
Yeah,
it was, and it's not getting better. So, but yeah, for sure, I am West Coast biased on this very much. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, Richmond has a pretty high poverty rate, but the homelessness is very manageable. Like it's just not. It's part of the city. Like there is homelessness, but it's not like Berkeley. When I was living in Berkeley, like the middle of a pristine suburb, there's homeless people everywhere. It's like, which is kind
right.
of far. Um, yeah, I don't know how it's going to change. I mean, in San Francisco, they've already booted out some of the radicals on the school board and
Yeah.
on the board of supervisors. And they have, for by their standards, a law and order DA that was appointed by the mayor. So there's the political calculus should be shifting in San Francisco, at least. I don't know about LA, but the left wing activists are highly organized. They believe that they are fighting the good fight. They show up, and so that's how they have power. And so the folks like you and others in California cities have to organize and win the war of ideas, and then win the war of votes. There's no reason that can't
It's so
happen.
hard to win the war of ideas when I think you sound like a dick when you say you sound like an immoral jerk if you say anything remotely in the world of someone needs help. Something as simple as that. Like that's like the only level of it's so like not a radical perspective, but for some reason in a lot of people's minds, if you just say people need help, do they fully sign up for it? No, because like they're schizophrenic and they're high on meth, so no, they didn't fully sign up to receive help, but they kind of need help. Like,
Yeah.
like it's just saying that. Just saying that is so hard to say in some circles, and man, like I respect Schellenberger for going out there and saying these things. I kind of wish he would even be a little bit more humane. He like throws out terms like the radical left so much that I think that he just naturally turns certain demographics against him, which I think is not great. But man, like maybe what I'm saying is getting the messaging right on this in a way that we just get to a sane solution where we're moving towards a better world for all people. It's just so hard to get that messaging right, which means it's so hard to organize around it. I don't know. Maybe people will get so fed up with it they will start becoming more, willing to start talking like this. But God, you can probably hear my frustration and cynicism, right?
I
Right?
mean, you should be frustrated. You should absolutely be frustrated. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, you've got a kid, you're married. It's like you
Yeah.
don't want like homeless people are more likely to attack women. Funny how that is. Like that's not a
Right.
coincidence. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want your kid to be playing around with needles that are on the sidewalk or stepping over feces. Like, that's
Right.
disgusting. It's dangerous. So people should be fed up. And if California was a purple state, like you'd have like the Republican mind is just more predisposed to the like let's clean this shit up. Like it's just
Yeah.
like it's just how they it's just a different way of thinking, liberals versus conservatives.
Right. Right.
Um, but in a state that's so blue that like there's no it's hard to find that impulse to balance out the hardcore left wing groups. Um, and I think part of the problem too is that because California's housing is so expensive, like
Mhm.
that has a role for sure. It's like housing first. It doesn't make housing first the solution. Like you can't just do housing first and expect this to go away.
Right.
But I mean, the activists say like, look, the reason they're homeless is because housing is so expensive, so we just need to build housing. If housing in California became more affordable, but homelessness got worse, then you would be able to say, well, look, it's obviously I mean, we know they're doing drugs, right, guys? We know they're mentally ill. Like we know that is the case. So let's stop like beating around the bush. Like we have to deal with those problems too. Um, but yeah, no, and the activist groups need to be convinced. I don't know if you can convince them, but lawmakers need to be convinced that, and the public needs to be convinced that people with severe mental illness aren't more free when you let them roam the streets as homeless people or in prisons.
Hmm.
They're more free when you coerce them to do treatment. That's what
Right.
gives them freedom, is to become well.
Right.
And in a lot of
See,
places,
that's a good messaging. That's maybe that's something that I need to lean on more heavily when I'm having this conversation. That exact talking point, I actually like that because I agree with that. Although it's not, I've never framed it in exactly that way. But that's good. Yeah.
yeah, well, I'm happy to give you talking points, man.
All right.
I've
All
worked on 3
right.
political campaigns. I can eat, sleep, and breathe talking points.
Excellent. Hey, well, that's really good. Well, I'm gonna close out there. That was a lot of fun, Lee. Thanks for coming on the show, and let's talk again soon. I think that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a pleasure.